Funding for This Is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org.
I'm Khalil Colonna, and this is Nashville. 48 years ago today, the Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty in America, ruling that for certain crimes, execution is not cruel and unusual punishment.
By 7-2, the judges upheld the death penalty in Florida, Georgia, and Texas. Other states may be affected in a similar way. But by 5-4, the court struck down capital punishment laws in North Carolina and Louisiana. That ruling could prevent still other states from invoking their own death penalty laws.
Since then, states have struggled to set precedents and create their own laws around this sentence. Today, we're welcoming journalists and authors to talk about their work writing around this very difficult topic. Heads up for our listeners, this episode may mention graphic crimes, including rape. Now, I'd like to welcome our first guests. Liliana Segura is a journalist who writes with The Intercept. She covers the death penalty. And Stephen Hale, he's a journalist with the Nashville Banner and author of the new book, Death Row Welcomes You, Visiting Hour in the Shadow of the Execution Chamber. Thank you both for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Okay, so as we just said, today is the anniversary of the reinstatement of the death penalty in the U.S. And not only that, but just yesterday, a new Tennessee bill went into effect, allowing for the death penalty to be applied in cases of child rape. This seems to go against the previous Supreme Court decision. There's a lot to unpack. Stephen, can you help us make sense of this latest bill?
Yeah, so this law that just went into effect, as you say, contradicts a previous Supreme Court decision. And that's something that the sponsors of the bill were openly aware of. I mean, the Republican sponsors of this bill, when they were pushing it through committees and in the legislature, said multiple times that they thought that previous decision, which ruled that the death penalty couldn't be applied in cases like this, was wrong, and that they felt like the current court would overturn it. And so this is one of those laws that, possibly could end up in court later on if someone challenges it. And the sponsors are betting that if it made it all the way up to the Supreme Court, that it would go in their favor.
What was their impetus for sponsoring and creating this bill?
Well, so the bill, and I don't have it in front of me, so I'll just, in general terms, as you said, expands the death penalty as a possible punishment for people who are convicted of rape of a child. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, the bill sponsors kind of proposed this bill on the same terms that you hear a lot of people defend the death penalty in general, which is that they said, this is one of the worst crimes imaginable and it deserves the harshest punishment. The folks that pushed back against that bill, aside from people who just oppose the death penalty generally, there was some pushback from people, including victims and victims sort of support organizations, who said that they feared that law and applying the death penalty to those cases could have a chilling effect on people reporting these kinds of crimes, because often child sexual assault cases occur within a family. So the alleged perpetrator is a family member of the victim. And so they express a concern that, if someone knows that their family member could be facing a punishment like that, it could keep them from coming forward. We should note, obviously, I'm sure there are victims who feel all different sorts of way about this, but that was one of the arguments that came up.
We're going to talk about this a little bit later on in the show, but from my knowledge, Tennessee hasn't executed anyone since 2020, correct?
That's right, yeah.
Why?
Like many things, the state's historic execution spree was stopped by COVID-19. There were several executions that were postponed or called off because of the pandemic. And then after that, when things were opening up again in society and, they could have carried out an execution, presumably, executions were called off because of some real questions and problems that had come up around the lethal injection protocols in the state. And the governor ended up ordering a review of those. And so we've kind of been in a holding pattern since then.
Or do we have a guess when the dates will be handed out again?
Not really. And this is one thing I know Liliana can speak to as well. I mean, there's the whole death penalty process is just so lacking in transparency of any kind, even to the people who are working within it, even to the lawyers of people on death row, who I have been in the position of calling a defense attorney before to ask them for their response to something that's just come out that they didn't know about yet. So all that to say, no, it's not very clear when the Supreme Court would start scheduling executions again and what kind of litigation there may or may not be around those. So we're kind of in the dark as far as that goes.
Now, Liliana, a lot of your work has been with the federal death penalty. Can you describe for us what that is and how that differs from a state policy like here in Tennessee?
Sure. So, the federal death penalty, in many ways, the systems are actually similar. But I think that also there's a perception that the federal system is in some way better, that it's kind of this gold standard, that this is, a better version of what we have here in Tennessee and in other states. And that is just simply not true. If I learned anything during the time that I was covering the federal executions, which, just to back up, in the summer of 2020, in the midst of the pandemic that actually stopped Tennessee's execution spree, the Trump administration decided that it was going to go ahead and start executing people on federal death row. Federal death row is in Terre Haute, Indiana. And in the summer of 2020, they started what would ultimately be 13 executions over the course of 6 months. And part of the surreal, frightening experience of covering these executions was that it was at this time during, this is COVID at a time when there were no vaccines. People were very, very concerned for their health and safety. And this was something that was happening in the name of public safety, incredibly reckless decision. But anyway, there is a perception that the people on federal death row surely they must have been convicted of terrorism crimes, that sort of thing. In fact, that's not at all the case. They are often crimes that look much more similar to the, still horrifying murders, that sort of thing, the crimes that send people to state death row. But it's just simply not true. And you see a lot of the same problems in the federal system that you would otherwise see at the state level. I did want to just say one thing, because it's relevant to the system as a whole, about this new law that's taking effect. Obviously, so much of this system, the way that it operates, is animated by politics. And in truth, Tennessee is one of many states that have sought to pass this kind of legislation expanding the death penalty to non-homicide crimes as a result of Ron DeSantis's work in Florida. It was Ron DeSantis, when he had political ambitions, who decided that he was going to not only start executing people in Florida, but also seek to push legislation that would expand the state's death penalty. And Florida was the first to push through a bill that was intended to punish people who were guilty of raping children, but not of killing them. So this is the death penalty for non-homicide crimes is a pretty serious step backwards when it comes to Eighth Amendment jurisprudence. And the case that you were discussing before, that the Supreme Court had handed down to this effect, was called Kennedy versus Louisiana, and that was in 2008. The Supreme Court said in 2008 that this was unconstitutional. That the death penalty for a non-homicide crime, no matter how horrific, a sexual assault against a child is horrific,
yes.
That this was unconstitutional. And so that's a bit of history. I mean, what we're seeing now is that a lot of states are adopting this Florida model, including Tennessee.
Are there any restrictions from the feds that, what I want to ask is, can the state do something that the federal government can't do, and is that vice versa the same? Are there restrictions to how they can go about conducting executions?
You mean in terms of carrying out executions,
yes.
or in terms of the constitutional? I mean, the this Constitution guides all death penalty cases. And so if a case, if a given defendant gets a trial that's unfair because lawyers were not up to the task, then everyone, at least in theory, is entitled to their Sixth Amendment rights, and they can challenge their conviction based on that. Unfortunately, for people trying to challenge their convictions and death sentences, the procedural barriers that stand in the way are really significant. And that's one area where you see, at the federal level, you don't have the state sort of appellate structure that at least in theory, helps people challenge their cases. So in many ways, the federal system affords less of an opportunity to challenge convictions and death sentences, even when there's egregious errors in those cases.
Wow. Okay, now you talked about politics being heavily involved in this. In November, we've got an election coming up. Will you both be keeping your eyes on, what are you going to be keeping your eyes on for the next 4 years when it comes to the death penalty? Like, what are you anticipating coming from either of the candidates?
Well, I mean, as Liliana was saying, when Donald Trump was in office previously, we had that streak of executions, which something like that had not occurred for, you'd have to tell me, a long time. I mean, that was historic. So, obviously, Donald Trump has shown that he's willing to support that kind of thing. On the other hand, while that hasn't happened under current President Biden, he also hasn't taken a lot of the steps that many anti-death penalty groups and voters sort of were calling for. He hasn't said that he won't seek new death sentences, or that his Department of Justice wouldn't, I should say. And while there haven't been any carried out, he hasn't necessarily pulled the federal government away from it the way that some people would have liked to see. So please chime in, Liliana. I think it's kind of an open question as to which way it could go, as it relates to this issue. But
yeah, there is a tremendous amount of fear right now among people on federal death row, families of people on federal death row who I've spent a lot of time talking to in the past or earlier this year for a story that I wrote, that a new Trump administration would put a target on the backs of every single remaining person on federal death row. Trump has not been quiet about his intentions. It's very explicitly written in their plans that they intend to finish the work that they started, so to speak. And so part of what people really want to see who are connected to this issue is the Biden administration make a commitment to commuting sentences in ideally for people on the row to commuting all of the sentences to before Trump can come in and carry out this execution. I think that comes down to politics itself. And I also want to say, and this is maybe a longer discussion for another time, but the federal system is a good reminder that when it comes to the most extreme death penalty measures, the expansion of the death penalty historically, the Democratic Party is just as responsible for that as the Republicans have been. And one thing that's been on my mind as we've been talking about Kennedy versus Louisiana and the child rape law that's new here in Tennessee, I wrote about that decision in 2008 when the Supreme Court handed it down. And one of the most vocal critics in that moment was actually none other than Barack Obama, who was running for president and said that he supported the death penalty and that was a crime that should be punishable by death. And that was a pretty extreme position for him to adopt. So I think that the Democrats have to kind of look at themselves and recognize that they're responsible for a lot of this system.
It's definitely a nonpartisan issue. I wanted to ask you, did the Obama administration carry out any executions during his 8 years?
They didn't. Part of that had to do with the unavailability of lethal injection drugs. I also think that there really was a difference there in terms of political will. It just so happened that the same problem that the states were having getting some of these drugs for lethal injection, it was also a problem at the federal level.
I do want to talk about a little bit about the lethal injection issues that have been coming up and made news headlines. But before we go to break, Stephen, you have the new book, Death Row Welcomes You, Visiting Hours in the Shadow of the Execution Chamber. Can you give us a little bit of an overview of the book? Yeah,
so as we mentioned before, when Tennessee started what turned out to be a historic execution spree between 2018 and 2020, I started covering those cases and started meeting people who were kind of in proximity to death row, and the whole book sprang out of I was trying to kind of find a way to interview some folks on Tennessee's death row, and in that process, I ended up people who regularly go to visit the men on death row. These were people I didn't know existed. I didn't know there was a community like this, and because of some of the unique things about Tennessee's death row, there is. And so the book is more or less about that community of visitors from the outside world and men on Tennessee's death row in the context of that kind of 2-year death row or execution streak.
We got to go to break, but can you read a little section before we get
Sure, yeah. This is just a section from the first time that I actually myself got to go out to death row and visit some of the folks there, and one man in particular who I ended up getting pretty close to. The death row visitation gallery looked something like a small indoor bus station or the waiting room at a dystopian doctor's office. An arrangement of blue and red chairs connected in groups of 2 and 3 were surrounded by off-white concrete walls and overseen by a large convex mirror hanging near the ceiling. In a corner near the entrance, there was a microwave and a cooler of water with a stack of small cups. Nearby, a small shelf held items for children, puzzles, games, a Mr. Potato Head. We'd just walked in when a man emerged from a door toward the back of the room wearing a white t-shirt and a beige Tennessee Department of Correction issued pants. It was Terry King. He was 56 years old then, with a bald head, a gray goatee, and skin paled by more than 35 years without sunlight. He walked toward us and reached his hand into a manila envelope he was carrying, revealing its contents with a smile. I brought popcorn. Terry knew I was a reporter, but I had agreed not to write about the visit for the paper. We all understood that, given the prison's aversion to granting media access, a story like that could get me banned from visiting and possibly have repercussions for David, who's one of Terry's other visitors, as well. I knew of Terry what I'd heard from David and gleaned from a brief Google search. The latter informed me that in 1983, during a drunken and drug-fueled summer when he was 21 years old, Terry had participated in 2 Knoxville area murders. Now, 35 years later, he was greeting me on death row with a bag of popcorn. He handed the bag to David and reminded him of just how long to cook it, repeating the instructions facetiously in a loud East Tennessee twang. Apparently, during a previous visit, David had overdone it, ruining the snack and filling the small visitation gallery with an incriminating stench. On this night, he returned to the group with an unburnt bag, and we each shook a bit of popcorn out onto the napkins we'd laid on our laps. We sat close in the hard plastic chairs, our knees nearly touching. The room filled up with around 15 or 20 people, and we leaned in closer to hear each other as voices and laughter bounced off the concrete walls. We talked without any particular aim. David and Al and Terry catching up a bit, me and Terry sharing bits and pieces about ourselves as we went. I mentioned that I'd grown up in Florida, not far from Daytona Beach, and Terry recalled how he'd driven down there on a few occasions. We laughed about how crazy it seemed that they used to let people drive their cars on the beach, and Terry shook his head, remembering out loud how he'd spent much of his time there getting drunk and chasing women. Later, when I told him about my newborn daughter, who was sweet and healthy but still crying all through the night, his face softened, and he told me how lucky I was. After more than 3 decades in prison, he said, he could not even summon the sound of a crying baby in his mind.
That is an excerpt from Stephen Hale's new book, Death Row Welcomes You, Visiting Hours in the Shadow of the Execution Chamber. We're going to now take a short break. When we come back, we'll talk about what it's like to be in close proximity to executions, why the punishment exists, and the difficult impact on victims and their families. Stay with us. This is Nashville.
Funding for This is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org.
I'm Khalil Ekolona, and this is Nashville. We're discussing the death penalty, what one of our guests called the darkest corner of the criminal justice system. What is it like to witness an execution? Why do we have this punishment in place? And what are the stories of the victims of those who are on death row? How have their families been impacted by this punishment? We're here to get more information on this with my guests, Liliana Segura. She's a journalist who covers the death penalty for The Intercept, and Stephen Hale, journalist at the Nashville Banner and author of the book Death Row Welcomes You, Visiting Hour in the Shadows of the Execution Chamber. Again, thank to you both for being here. I kind of want to talk about why we have this form of corporal punishment in our state and nationally. Can either of you, Liliana, can you give me a history of how it began and the argument for this punishment?
Well, the death penalty in some form or other, as old as this country, is really there's always been sort of, an idea that whether it's an eye for an eye or that you should sacrifice your life if you take the life of another. And historically, if you look at the history of this country, it is absolutely impossible to disentangle that concept from our nation's history of slavery, in all of its different forms. And so and you can see this state to state. You can see this. Stephen actually writes very well about Tennessee's early death penalty. The crime was, or the punishment was reserved for certain kinds of crimes. And in general, but in general, you could absolutely see that the people most targeted were often people of little means or who were otherwise demonized, sort of considered, and obviously that includes racial minorities. You see that legacy play out to this day, and so that's not a historian's answer, but that is sort of one of the through lines that you see most clearly. And in fact, talking about the anniversary of Gregg versus Georgia, the reinstatement of the death penalty in this country, some years ago, I undertook a project with a colleague where we tried to trace to see, as the death penalty declines, what are we seeing in terms of those kinds of statistics? And one of the startling findings, which shouldn't really surprise me, is that even as states sentence fewer and fewer people to die, in many states you're seeing those people look even more starkly overrepresentative of people of color than ever before. And so that's a big part of the history of the death penalty in this country.
Well, Stephen, can you give us some background on the state's history?
Yeah, I mean, it mirrors basically what Liliana just said, which is that, I think it's Brian Stevenson, the author of Just Mercy, and obviously a death penalty lawyer himself, who said that the death penalty is the stepchild of lynching, basically. And so that history exists in Tennessee in a very literal way, which is that when execution started in Tennessee, they were hanging. So, I mean, there's there it's as close as it can get, and that those were often very public affairs and kind of, bringing a lot of people out to see this convicted person hanged, and the methods have changed over the years. But as Liliana says, the sort of demographic disparities, if you will, the racial disparities have carried on. And as well as the economic and sort of class disparities. I mean, you won't. I have not come across a person sitting on death row that either I've written about or read about who is either it doesn't have some sort of mental illness in their history, didn't grow up in abject poverty, was not marginalized in some way, was not abused as a child or something like this. So we're drawing from a very thin slice of society. Often in historically unfair ways.
Have either of you spoken to people who are proponents of the death penalty and also folks who would consider themselves abolitionists? I'm interested in what the conversations about the concept of corporal punishment in this form are like. Who have you spoken to, and what are their arguments?
In my I've spoken, so full transparency, I kind of come to this issue more closer to activists and activism than through sort of traditional journalistic, career, I guess. Mm-hmm. And so from the start, and both these guys Stephen has written very well about proximity. I got to know people who had been wrongfully sentenced to death, and I got to know their families as a college student, essentially. And it was a moment that immediately radicalized me, sort of made me believe that this was wrong. It wasn't until many, many years later that I was able to sort of tell those stories in a journalistic capacity. So I've been familiar with the sort of abolitionist side, so to speak, for a long time. What I have found consistently about people who are proponents of capital punishment is that, not to a one, but oftentimes if you ask an average person if they support the death penalty and they say yes, it is more of an abstract concept. I'm not saying this is true always, but much of the time it's something that they haven't actually encountered close up, that they haven't known, that hasn't impacted them directly. And so what I have found is that the more you learn about the system, the more you see its flaws, the more your tendency is to sort of say, well, maybe this isn't the greatest idea. So that's been my experience largely with supporters of the death penalty, which does not mean that they're not sincere in their beliefs at all.
Oh, okay. I get that. I understand. Thank you for sharing that. Notoriously, appeals cases in courts can go a very long time. I imagine decades spent litigating these cases. It's not just expensive, but it's hard for everyone involved, especially victims' families. For example, Purvis Payne, who's still incarcerated, was recently moved from death row after more than 30 years. During one of his hearings in 2021, the family, Sharice and Lacey Joe Christopher, spoke out in remembrance of them and in favor of the death penalty. Let's listen to a clip from Katie Heights. She's Miss Christopher's sister-in-law.
And what I saw after the murder of my sister-in-law and little Lacey was a family that shattered. Previously, we all got together. Everybody was happy. After that, well, Grandma, I don't know, Grandma, how you do it? How do you get by without your daughter and little Lacey, little sweet Lacey? I don't know. All I know is it affects the family. They're not. We stopped Christmases. We always had joyful gifts, and all the holidays were so joyful, and it was such a large family, and there was so much love, and it was taken away from us. Cherise didn't have a choice. We didn't have a choice. She'll never be free because she's forever with the angels. It affected my husband. He felt that because he was a man, and he was, that he should have been there to protect his sister. And I saw that man, a grown man, cry. I saw him fall in grief. I saw so many of the Zavalnik family fall in grief. He took away something that we can never, ever can get back. We can never walk away and build a life again the way that it should have been. It needed to be. My husband had a lot of anger. He was depressed. Eventually, the anger and his depression affected the household. And I loved him. He was my sweetheart, and we went all through school together. We had some great times. We have great children. And it was taken away. It was taken away. He turned into, he was so angry. I couldn't live with it anymore. He was damaging my children. And because somebody took his life. They took his life when they took Cherise and Lacey's life.
I want to offer a correction. That was a statement from Kathy Heights. I mistakenly said Katie. But, as we can all hear, this family is still actively going through so much after 30 years. The pain is palpable through Kathy's voice. And we have to acknowledge that in many of these cases, the number of victims far exceeds the number of lives lost. And Miss Heights, she said that her husband lost his life. He lost himself when his sister was murdered. What are your thoughts on that, what we just heard, y'all?
I mean, it's unthinkable. It's hard to react to that in any way, except to say that it's devastating to listen to think about, and I think it's important that we look at all of this with as clear eyes as we can, which is to say the victims and their families. And like you say, it's a nuclear bomb that goes off in a community when something like that happens. It's family. And I think that, I would never want to have any conversation about the death penalty that would appear to be obscuring any of that. I think the question for just speaking for myself as a journalist and someone who's trying to approach this was, how can I do my best to try to look at all of this? So what the victims experience, what their families experience, the truth of what they went through in terms of the details, however horrifying they are, of a crime, and then what the person who's been sent to death row for that, what their life was, what their life is now, and then what it's like when we actually execute someone. And so, and which, by the way, and I'm not even, this isn't even about equating them, it's just another part of this process, which is that when an execution happens, that's also a bomb that goes off. Mm-hmm. It's also, people close to that person, people in the prison even, who have been working at a prison for years and know that person. And again, it's not to say the pain is the same, or it's nothing like that, but it's just to say that all through this system is pain and grief and trauma. And to me, it seems like the best we can do as a society, a state, country, whatever, is to just look at it head on, straight on, and not turn our eyes from any of it, and try to go from there.
Liliana, through your work, have you seen any families be able to find peace and closure after an execution?
That's a good question. Closure really is the word. Closure is the promise that is given by prosecutors, by the state, to family members so often at a death penalty trial. I can't tell you how many times I've read in a transcript or seen up close the promise that if a jury sends someone to death row, this is going to mean closure for the family. And that is just simply not true in terms of how the system operates. In terms of you mentioned the lengthy appeals that take place. There's a lot of good reasons why, or not good as in justifiable, but there are a lot of reasons why appeals drag on, sometimes for decades, that have to do with some of the failures, the constitutional failures that you see in some of these cases. However, what that amounts to for victims, for their families, is that a total inability to move on in a meaningful way from this crime that shattered their lives. And I've heard so many family members, so many victims' family members say after an execution, this doesn't bring closure. This doesn't, it closes a chapter, but nothing is going to bring my loved one back. And so I would never, Stephen, I think, put it really, really well, but I would never purport to try to claim to know what one family feels versus another. But what I do know is that the death penalty as a system has not served them, has not delivered on the promise that they were given many years before.
How often do victims' family members actually witness the executions?
How often, as far as like a specific number, I couldn't say, but I know in my experience just covering Tennessee's executions in recent history, it was pretty split. I mean, there were some of those where the family members were there and they were separate from the media witnesses, but were in the building, to witness, or were there to give a statement afterwards, or other times they, would send a statement and then, say a prosecutor or someone who was on hand would read it, and so that they were represented there. And so there was definitely a mix of how people felt about that. I talked to one woman whose daughter had been murdered decades ago, and I talked to her before the execution of the man that murdered her daughter, and she said, I'm not coming to Tennessee for that because it doesn't do anything for me. She's like, I want this to be over. To Liliana's point, she was ready to stop getting mail about this, to stop being alerted when there was another court hearing, to just move on past it. So yeah, but to answer your question, I think it's the whole spectrum.
If you're just tuning in, this is Nashville, and I'm your host, Khalil Ekalona. We're talking this hour about the death penalty with journalist Liliana Segura and Stephen Hale. I'd like to bring in our next guest. Joe Ingle is a chaplain who spent decades visiting death rows in the South. He's the author of the book, Too Close to the Flame. Joe, thank you for being here with us today.
Glad to be here.
So would you say it's fair to call yourself a death penalty abolitionist?
Well, in the sense that I do not believe in the death penalty, that's fair. But I think the reality is the death penalty is not an issue for me. It's people. I've spent the last since 1974, working with men and women on death row across the South, and also with victims' families. So I am intimately familiar with this process. And my colleagues are too gentle, because the reality is this is a killing machine. It is not about justice. It has no semblance of justice in the entire process. You cannot show it to me. And I no longer refer to the criminal justice system as that. It's the criminal legal system. It's criminal, it's legal, and it's a system. But you're not going to find people receiving a fair shake in that system, no matter what it purports to do. I have sat through trials. I have sat through hearings on appeal. I have been in the death chamber. I'm here to tell you, this is a machine geared up to kill people, and a very few people. It's really interesting. We have 20,000 murders approximately a year, and out of that, maybe 200 come to death row. And you think, oh, well, these are the worst killers. Well, actually, no. As Steve Bright says, a veteran death penalty lawyer, the people who come to death row don't commit the worst crime. The people who come to death row have the worst lawyer. And that's very true. And that's all because, why? They have no money to hire a lawyer. So And don't believe there's some great public defender systems out here representing people. Some of our southern states still don't have death penalty defense in terms of that trial level. It's court-appointed lawyers. And it is a woeful situation. So I really want to stress, let's be real here. And it's heartbreaking to hear that earlier sharing from that victim's family because they are not served by this process. In my book, I talk about the black family who were very much opposed to the execution of the man who killed their daughter. And why were they opposed? Well, they were Christian and they saw it from that point of view. But also, just like she spoke about, they were broken. They did not want that scab pulled off through public hearings. They did not want more publicity. They didn't want to have to deal with this at all. They wanted him held accountable, but they did not want him prosecuted for the death penalty because they knew it just re-aggravate the wound they'd suffered from the rape and murder of their daughter.
I understand the point that you're taking, and you're looking at the humanity of this and the moral question of it. But Stephen and Liliana, I apologize for calling you Juliana earlier because I'm sorry, I don't know where my head was. You're both journalists, and you're tasked with being objective and impartial, right? How can you really separate your job's function, particularly on this topic, from your humanity, or does your opinion find its way into your work?
I'll let Liliana answer too, but just quickly, I mean, I don't separate my humanity from my work, or at least I try not to. I do try to be fair and honest. The word objective gets tricky. I don't know what different people mean by that. I try to be fair and honest, and here's a way I'll explain that. When I was writing my book, I was writing from the perspective of having met some people on death row and sat in a room with them, as I read earlier, and talked with them and gotten to know them. So is that objective? I mean, probably not. I care about the people that I got to know, and I liked being around them, and I didn't want them to be executed. So I guess that's not objective, but I tried to be very honest about what they were there for, what they had done in the cases where they even admitted their guilt, and not to leave any of that out. And like I said earlier, to just say, as honestly as I could, this is all of it. This is the person who's on death row. This is what they did. This is what the state's going to do to them. This is what it looks like when the state executes someone. And so that's the best I feel like I can do as not just a journalist, but as a person. But
Yeah, I think that's really well put. And I guess I mentioned before that I actually came to this issue through activism, through proximity with activists and with exonerated and actually with relationships with people who are on death row. So I've never claimed, quote unquote, objectivity. I guess I would also say that this is an issue. So I've never started from the premise that, well, maybe killing people in a death chamber is good, and maybe I need to represent that side of it. That's never really been my priority. I will say that the experience of witnessing an execution last year, I witnessed 2 last year, and the second one speaks to what you asked about sort of having to put your humanity aside. There is a very bizarre aspect to witnessing an execution as a journalist, but for anybody, where you are there as guests of the state. You have essentially made a commitment to not disrupt this killing that is happening before your eyes. You're not going to stand up and say it's wrong. You're not going to get in the way. You have sort of made that decision. And for me, one of the things that really did feel like I was having to put my humanity aside in that moment was the experience of sitting behind a woman who was watching a man be killed, a man who she had come to love and advocate for, and having the instinct to reach over and comfort her as this was happening, but also knowing that that wouldn't have been appropriate in that moment. That and I found that very chilling and sort of corrosive, and I've thought about that a lot over the past few months. This idea that this system contorts us into positions that really are not human, and they feel very unnatural, and I think that's very destructive.
Okay, so before we say goodbye to you both, is there anything that you wish I would have asked, that we would have asked? Anything that you'd love to mention?
I think actually Liliana just ended on a thing I was sort of thinking, which is the not to center myself on this issue, but as it relates to us and how we report on it, just that anyone who watches this process, Joe just mentioned it. If you watch this process from beginning to end, trials, hearings, talk to victims hear that recording we heard earlier, but also if you witness an execution, we do a lot of things to dress these things up, but they look exactly like killing a person. That's what it looks like. And Liliana is exactly correct that in my experience, that when I witnessed executions, I felt it was very important for me to do that. But I also did eventually feel like I'm being scripted into this. I'm playing a role in this that doesn't feel good. I think it's important, but it also did feel corrosive is the right word. And I think that says a lot about the system.
I want to thank you both for being here. Liliana Segura is a journalist who writes with The Intercept about death row, and Stephen Hale's a journalist with the Nashville Banner and the author of the new book, Death Row Welcomes You, Visiting Hour in the Shadow of the Execution Chamber. Thank you both again for being with us, and thank you for your reporting. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Joe Ingle is going to stay with us through the break. When we come back, we'll be talking with Joe Ingle about his time as a chaplain and abolitionist advocate on death row. You can always join the conversation by tweeting us at This Is Nashville. We'll be right back. I'm Khalil Colonna, and this is Nashville. We've been talking about the death penalty here in Tennessee and across the nation. My guest now is Joe Ingle. He's the author of the book, Too Close to the Flame. And author of the book, Too Close to the Flame, with the condemned inside the Southern killing machine. He has been working with death in the death penalty realm for over 40 years, nearly 50. Joe, thank you for being here. I'm sorry for that horrible, sloppy intro. Can you give me some of your history with the death penalty?
Sure. I backed into the death penalty. I was living and working in East Harlem when I was in seminary and Union Theological Seminary in New York. And Attica happened in 1971, and I realized my neighbors were dealing with the cops and prosecutors all the time, and I'd never even been in a jail. So I spent that year visiting men at the Bronx House of Detention, and they educated me about what the system was like. They were all technically awaiting trial. They had not been convicted. The average wait was 18 months for a trial. So they're all poor. They were all either Puerto Rican or African American, except for one white guy. So when I came back south, I wanted to be involved in prison ministry, and that's what I did beginning in 1974 because Will Campbell hired me to set up Southern Coalition on Jails and Prisons, which was an outfit that worked across the South. So I visited every death row in the South, and we also worked against mass incarceration.
Now, some Christians often use Scripture as a basis for the death penalty. I take it you don't see the verses the same way.
Well, you can read the verses for what they say, and there are 23 verses that support the death penalty. But when you look at them, virtually every one of them, well, all of them, are in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, written for society 3,000 years ago. I really don't think anyone today wants to say, oh, yeah, we want to execute a kid for talking back to a parent, or we want to execute someone for adultery. No, I don't think we want to do that. And that's why if you're a Christian, you look at what Jesus said in the 8th chapter, because he addressed the death penalty in the 8th chapter of John when they brought a woman convicted of adultery. There's no doubt of her guilt. And he said, has anyone condemned you? And the people around her said, well, we can't condemn her because we're not without sin. He said, yeah. And she said, no, no one's condemned me. So those guys left. The two of them are there. And then he says to her, if no one has condemned you, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. Now, that's the radical message Jesus brings you. It's a message of forgiveness and reconciliation. It's not about revenge, which is what the death penalty is.
Or retribution.
Right.
In your book, you've written a lot of books, but the newest one, it's called Too Close to the Flame, with the condemned inside the Southern killing machine. You really don't hide the fact that you're opposed to capital punishment. You call it this failed institution. You did so as we started this conversation. Can you read us a passage from your book and set that up, what you're going to share with us, please?
Yes, this is, I was very close to Ed Zagorski at the Riverbend Maximum Security Institution here in Nashville. He was set for execution in early October 2018. And when you're set for execution in Tennessee, you're moved off of death row to death watch, which is a separate area of the prison. You're in a cell. All you have is a Bible. There's a guard outside your door watching your every move. And you're that way for 72 hours until they come and take you to the death chamber, which is just a few feet down the road here to where your cell is. And so I'm with Ed, and we're in early October, and I have 3 visits with him on consecutive days. We're on the final visit before his execution. And all of a sudden the door opens behind me, and the guard tells me there's a stay of execution. And no one will tell me why. So we're preparing for him to be killed here in 40 minutes. And all of a sudden it stopped. And so when I stumbled out into the darkness and asked a reporter what was going on, they told me they'd stopped the execution because they were worried the electric chair wouldn't work. They weren't concerned about Ed.
Okay.
So we went back through this on November 1st, which is All Saints' Day on the Christian calendar. So I'm going to read here from my book, which is my last visit with Ed Zagorski before he was electrocuted.
Okay.
After I'd cleared security, my escort took me to Death Watch. I entered through the 2 doors, signed into the logbook, received a final pat-down, and then went through the door to the foyer. I entered the non-contact visitation booth, and Ed was already waiting on the other side of the glass. He smiled. He was excited. His enthusiasm surprised me. Joe, I have to tell you about the dream I had last night. I can't believe it. You know about my fantasy of the afterlife. Women in bikinis no older than 21, a Harley, and no cops, he chuckled. I smiled and nodded. Well, last night I slept soundly, and I had a dream about what I think the afterlife is really like. And I saw Laurie, the woman I cared for so much years ago. She was waiting for me after this. She reached out and took my hand, and we walked across a grassy area. She told me everything was going to be all right. It was an incredible feeling, peaceful. Then she told me to hold tight. She squeezed my hand, and I held hers tightly. Then we took off. We were flying. I couldn't believe it. I wasn't afraid, but it felt strange. Then I saw trees ahead. We were headed right for them. I pointed them out to Laurie. I thought we would smash into them, but she didn't seem concerned. And we flew right through them. We came out on the other side and landed. We were back on the grass again. Ed was bubbling with excitement as he shared the dream. Ed, I said, that seems more like a vision than a dream. Whatever it was, it made a powerful impact on Ed. He discussed his relationship with Laurie again, how much he cared for her, and how he believed that she would be waiting for him, extending her hand after he was killed in the electric chair. It was hard to believe we were less than 4 hours from his execution. He was excited as a kid with a new toy.
That's very powerful. Thank you for sharing that. You said that his execution was stayed as they were unsure about the effectiveness of the electric chair. Can you tell us what happened next?
Well, he was electrocuted shortly after this, and they were worried about the optics of it. A guy I work with in Florida, they electrocuted him, and his head caught on fire. So they hadn't used the electric chair in a while, so they had stayed him on the first round of his execution date. But this time he was successfully electrocuted.
You're a religious leader. You've been in this field doing this work as long as I have been alive. Is your thought or your thoughts on this, in your opinion, are they thought out by parishioners, other folks? Like, what do you tell them about your stance on the death penalty from a spiritual perspective from the people who you worship with?
Well, people I worship with are very clear where I am, and they're interested. Matter of fact, a lot of them from Christ Church Cathedral are part of a visitation on death row program that we have out at Riverbend. We have, since 1975, matched people up one-on-one to visit a death row prisoner, and these are from congregations in Middle Tennessee, including one Jewish congregation. So they know what we're talking about when we're talking about the death penalty in Tennessee, because they're actively involved in visiting men on death row. So it's not a theoretical conversation, if you will. It's personal. We all know what the death penalty is like in this state and how it's failed everyone in the system.
Talk about how it's failed everyone in the system, and we understand that. You mentioned it. Our previous guests mentioned it, that this sometimes has not only just an unfair position towards people who are economically disadvantaged, but also it's race-based as well. Talk to me a little bit about that. You said it's the criminal legal system, not the criminal justice system.
Well, let's talk about the racial angle, because that's really at the heart of it.
I got like 30 seconds.
Okay. Just briefly, Warren McCluskey v. Kemp, a guy I work with on death row, went to the U.S. Supreme Court. His case demonstrated there's racial discrimination in the history of Georgia in the administration of the death penalty. It's uncontroverted. That study's been replicated in 20 other states. It is still uncontroverted. We have racial discrimination in the administration of the death penalty in this country. Pure and simple.
Anything you wish I would have asked you?
I guess there's so much we could have talked about that maybe we should do a whole hour sometime.
We could definitely do that. I'd love to have you on, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah. Joe Ingle is a religious leader who spent decades visiting death rows in the South. He's the author of the new book, Too Close to the Flame. Joe, thank you for being here, and thank you for the work that you're doing,
Thank
sir.
you.
And thanks to you for tuning in this hour. This Nashville is a production of Nashville Public Radio. And guess what, y'all? It's our 500th episode. 500. We made it. Congratulations to the team, and congratulations to you all as well. Today's episode was produced and directed by Tasha A.F. Lemley. Our technical director and board operators, Liv Lombardi. The masterminds behind our theme music are LaRange and Namir Blade. You can listen back at thisisnashville.org or wherever you get good podcasts. And the conversation doesn't end here. Tweet us at This Is Nashville. Find us on Instagram and tell us what you want from our show by filling out our quick survey online. You can also call us and leave us a message at 615-760-2000, and trust us, we do check them. This is Nashville. I'm Khalil Colonna. We'll see you tomorrow, everybody, and be good to each other.